So thank you very much. Thank you very much to our speakers. This session is on topics in microeconomic theory. The papers will center largely around important questions of behavioral economics. So without taking any more time, I give it up to our first speaker. Rounak, please go ahead with your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so thank you for coming to this particular presentation of mine. So today the paper that I'm going to present is entitled Altruistic Preference in Crime Perception, which I've written along with Dr. Tirtha Chatterjee and Dr. Ritika Jain from Center for Development Studies, Kerala. Now, without further ado, let me quickly delve into the outline of the particular presentation for today. So initially, I'll just set the floor up. I mean, I'll just, as a warm-up, I'll just talk about what exactly we're trying to do in this particular paper, what kind of relationship we're trying to look at, and just introduce the topic to all of you. And then I'll go into the theoretical background and basically we have proposed a theoretical model, so I'll get into that first and then talk about the propositions that we have, and then we move on to the empirical section where we have tried to validate the results empirically by resorting to some econometric methodology. So that will be roughly, and then there will be discussions, conclusion, and a few limitations of our study. So roughly that will be the structure. So without further ado, let me just go into this thing. How do I minimize this? Okay. Okay, so crime as a field of research has come into the limelight largely after the seminal work of Baker, which is Crime and Punishment and Economic Approach, which was published in 1968. After that, crime became a very hot topic for the sociologists, economics, and many other policymakers alike as a topic of research. And they have started trading on different paths or try to explore different correlates of crime, so as to say. And in the recent literature, one of the important aspects or concepts with which crime has found its name attached or associated is none other than social capital, on which Putnam and Usrana and many other social scientists and economists have done a lot of research. And this social capital and its apparent relationship with crime and its correlates is what forms the core of this particular study that we have undertaken. Now, what is basically social capital? It's nothing but an informal set of values that is shared among the members of a particular community or a group that helps them to basically cooperate with one another. Now, social capital, there is another stream of literature which says that social capital also helps to deal with collective action problems. And that's where, in that particular literature, the concept of collective efficacy becomes very important. So collective efficacy is basically where the group of people are coming together to get involved in a particular activity to achieve a particular goal efficiently. Now, collective efficacy in the literature has also been taken as an important predictor of fear of crime. So as you can see, the literature in one section has focused on crime and its correlates and the apparent association of the correlates with social capital. That is one section of one strand of literature. The other strand of literature has focused upon the social capital and its apparent association with collective action problems, and that in turn has some relationship with crime or its correlates. So what we are trying to do, but then if you see the kind of literatures, the kind of results that these particular studies have found, most of the results have been mixed results, which we believe have happened because, and we argue on the lines of Gibson, saying that such relationships cannot really exist in a sociological vacuum, as Gibson has pointed out in his paper. We also believe that, and we therefore in our study tried to see the interplay between these three variables, and we consider several socio-democratic variables as mediators, which would define the relationship between crime and its correlates with the social capital. So what we're going to do in this this particular paper, we extend a prototype agri household model proposed by Singh et al. 1986 and build a two-stage sequence. There is this government or the leader, let's say, who decides on how much to spend on crime-reducing activities. Let's consider that to be A. And then after that is decided, in the second stage, the identical homogeneous households decide upon their consumption, expenditure, and everything, all the way. So basically, it's a two-stage sequential game. So our theoretical model has some predictions on the nature of the relationship between altruistic behavior, altruistic preference, and crime, and then we test that the validity of that particular result with the help of IV probit methodology. And also to mention this particular juncture of the presentation that we have used basically a broader definition of perception of crime based on study of threat of victimization as opposed to the previous studies. Okay, so the basic setup of the model is as follows. As I said, that we take the Singh et al.'s basic agricultural household model as the base model, and we incorporate two aspects, namely altruistic tendencies and perceptions related to crime. Now, the main focus of the model is to examine the channels that drive participation in an activity collectively, not exploring the other facets of collective action theory, because collective action theory in general has a very wide range of audience, and so much of research has already been done. So we are not interested in the other facets of that particular theory. We hypothesize that a representative individual, in this particular case, a representative household, before indulging in any particular activity collectively, weighs two different sources of utility gain, namely one benefit that is accrued to the individual directly, other one is the benefit that ensures the societal welfare at large. Now, our study focuses on whether there exists a relationship between the perception of crime in the society and the altruistic selves of individual entities or not. So, as I already mentioned, we propose this two-stage sequential game, where in the first stage, the government, let's say, or the leader, takes decision on how much to spend on crime-reducing activities. Let's denote that as set A. Now, the set of such activities would comprise of, let's say, strong judicial system, effective policing, use of technology, and so on and so forth, whatever is required to have an effective monitoring and to impede the growth of criminal activities. Now, once the government chooses that, the citizens will optimize their objective functions. Now, suppose that there are inidentical households and the market for agriculture products is supposed to be or assumed to be perfectly competitive. Now, for any production cycle, the following is the utility function that the households are trying to maximize. What are these particular terms? XA, XM, XLR, respectively, agricultural staple, market purchase good, and leisure. And we have introduced a new parameter in this particular context, which is called the efficiency parameter, which is defined as follows: M minus M naught. M is basically the time required for an individual household to do a activity individually that can be done collectively, and M naught is basically being historically observed, is the amount of time that is needed to solve the same problem if the community does it collectively. Now, this parameter again depends upon several social and household characteristics. There are two constraints. One is the first one, you can say the cash income constraint, and the second was the time budget constraint. So if you note in the actual model, there was only XL plus F equals to T. We have introduced these two new terms called I and M. We already know what is M. So let us try to understand what is I. Now you can read what are P and M, PA and PM, PL. These are basically the prices of market purchase commodity and staple respectively. And PL is basically the market wage. So we also have another constraint called product, and K, it's a fixed capital stock. Now we are introducing something called I, which is basically the crime perception parameter here, which is capturing, which basically denotes the amount of time that the individual spends, individual household spends in thinking about crime, which of course gets determined in the first stage of the model. This is how we are introducing or trying to capture the crime perception. So we believe that the crime perception in a particular household is very high. They'll devote more time in thinking about the kind of criminal activities that have infested their areas. Now, the objective function for the utility maximizing agriculture household can be as follows, subject to this for two constraints, where the first term refers to the individual's household utility, and the second one refers to the overall utility of the other household, excluding the ith household. Now, alpha is the altruistic parameter in this particular, in the context of the particular model. Alpha takes a value 0, it simply means that the household is selfish, and if alpha takes a value 1, it would simply mean that the household is only concerned about the welfare of the entire society. So instead of taking a very generalized function, we take take a specific functional form, which is the Cobb-Douglas function, and rewrite the equation, and we get the following. And so basically we have had three constraints, right? So we do some manipulations and try to bring it down to one single constraint, which is given here. Now so let's talk about the stages now of the optimization. The first stage, we know that the leader, the objective function of the leader is as follows, where the first term, the first expression, B minus C, basically refers to the benefit minus cost accrued, benefits minus cost associated with the crime reducing activities A. So B minus C is basically net benefit, which is being weighed by theta, and 1 minus theta, and the consumer surplus of the all other households is being weighed by 1 minus theta by the government. Now we are also imposing two additional functional forms, basically parabolic forms for the net benefit function as well as the crime perception function. So the net benefit function, so let's go to the graph, it will be easier to understand, I guess. So this is basically the crime perception, the graph for the crime perception function, and this is basically the graph for the net benefit function. What is the rationale behind choosing this? Is because at the initial stage of the level of activities A, the crime perception of the individuals will not adjust instantaneously, or maybe at the initial stage they might not give much importance to that, and they might continue adjusting their crime perception according to the level of activity. So initially it will go on increasing, it will reach a threshold, and after which it will get adjusted completely with the level of activity, and after that it will react to the level of activities and it start falling. But for the NA, which is the net benefit function, it happens the opposite, which is basically the first one is the curve concave to the x-axis, second one is the curve convex to the x-axis, given the fact that at the initial stage of setting up the judiciary system, the benefit cannot really outweigh the cost. Initially the marginal cost will outweigh the benefit, and that's the reason why at the initial stage it will go down, reach a minimum, and then starts increasing. And the nature of the equilibrium, as you can see, you just set up the Lagrange and solve for the optimal values. This is what you get. These are the became perfect Nash equilibrium, of course, of this sequential game. Now we substitute them in the objective function and get the indirect utility function in the following way. Now what the leader wants, the leader now wants to maximize her objective function with respect to A, to find the optimal A, of course, A star. And now after she gets A star, she tries to differentiate with respect to alpha. Why? Because our main objective is to find out how the crime perception changes with respect to altruism. So that is del I by del alpha. But I is a function of A, so by chain rule, you have to have first del A star by del alpha. So that's the reason we differentiate with respect to alpha. So now we straight away go to two of the lemmas that we have in our paper. The first one basically says that, so we also have one more assumption, which is that the highest point on the IA curve, if you see, reaches earlier than the lowest point on the NA curve, because there is a point in saying that the net benefit has started going up, even though we see that the crime perception is still high and still increasing. So that's the reason we have imposed this particular assumption, we invoke this particular assumption, and with that we say that the del A star by del alpha is going to be negative for all n greater than 2, if and only if the minimum point on the curve of NA always lies to the right of the maximum point of IA, and vice versa, of course. And now we differentiate equation 7, which is basically the IA, that equation. If we differentiate that with respect to alpha, we get the following. Now the second lemma is what is more interesting. We believe that says that if the del I star by del A is greater than 0, then in that case, del I star by del alpha will be less than 0. And if it's the opposite, it will have an opposite impact. So basically, we are dividing the entire region, the area under the curve, basically into two parts. One where the expenditure is very high, where the crime perception is also very high along with that. And the other area is where the expenditure is low. So if you go to the graph, so these are two sides. One expenditure is comparatively low and the other one is comparatively high. So at the initial stage of setting up the weather, it is gradually going up, crime perception is going up, but altruism is acting as a deterrent. But in the second stage, second half, with the crime perception is adjusted, the same altruistic parameter which was helping them to cope with their crime perception is now going to create more burden, is going to play on their insecurities, and will act as a catalyst in influencing the perception of crime of the individual households in that particular area. That is the proposition of this particular theory model. Now let us jump into the empirical strategy. Now I'll not delve into deeper because of the lack of time. So basically we take into account explicit account of the reverse causality and normative variable bias, basically the to deal with the endogeneity issue, which can be caused by mainly these two phenomena. So we take that into consideration by resorting to instrumental variable probit regression, specifications and analysis. Now this modeling approach, of course, is developed by Fishman and Stevens in 2007, that methodology has been used to decompose the altruistic behavior of a particular household into two parts. Namely, one is the idiosyncratic component, and another component which is the common to all households, village state cluster. And we believe that the cluster measure is what we can use, which is basically exogenous to the household, but can also be considered as the potential instrument for our analysis. And then we run the first stage regression, get the estimates, and fit it in the second stage and get the required estimates that we are looking for. Data and variable construction, we use ISDS2 round, which is the National Representative Multi-Topic Survey for the year 2011-12. And additionally, for the crime data, we capture it from the NCRB Bureau's publications, which is Crime in India, and then Prison Statistics. And then in summary, we basically use the household level information from the ISDS and merge it with the state level data from the NCRB records. And we keep the, of course, the urban households away from this analysis, because we have taken a rural kind of a setup for a theory model. So we believe that's best suited for the rural agricultural households. Now, what we do is we use a binary measure, which is the crime perception, namely crime 1 in the context of this particular paper, that takes a value 1 if anything gets stolen from the household or in case of forced entry in the last 5 months, and takes a value 0 otherwise. That's the main variable concern. Additionally, we also define two separate variables, dependent variables. One is called the theft one, and the threat one, the definitions of which are seen on the screen. The main variable of concern, which is basically the collective action variable termed as the collective, is also a binary variable that takes a value 1 if the household admits to solving a community problem in a particular village or neighborhood collectively, and takes a value 0 if that household prefers to solve it individually. This is what we use as a proxy for the altruistic preference. Given the nature of the questionnaire, this is what we can take out from the questionnaire as the variable for collective action, or altruistic preference for the matter. We assume that collective indicator takes a value 0, then the households are concerned of nothing else but their own efficiency gain. And if it's 1, then the altruism being coupled with the inclination towards the efficiency gain makes the household solve the problem collectively. Now, in order to deal with the endogeneity, we have constructed two variables, instruments, namely ME14 and D5, which basically says that 1 takes a value 1 if anyone in the household is a member of the ward committee or village panchayat. So we believe that if somebody from the household,
2 minutes left, Rounak. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So if somebody in the village panchayat, if somebody from the household is a member, then the possibility that there's a high possibility that the particular household might get involved in a collective activity more often than not. And D5 is basically says that if there are more number of households in the same caste, belonging to the same caste and religion that your household belongs to, and they participate more in collective activity, then there is a high chance that you too would look at them and get motivated, induced to participate in that collective activity. We have also control for other assets of the household, caste, religion, trust, trust in the courts to deliver justice, education, etc. as the controls. Now, this is the main result, and then we go to the subsamples. So the main result that you can see clearly says that there's a negative relationship, of course, significant for the first two dependent variables, but not is insignificant or threat one, of course. For the crime and theft one, it is highly significant, and we can see that. So that means that if the altruistic parameter goes up, then there's a high possibility that the crime perception of the households would go down. That, of course, while the past studies have found no significant relationship between social integration and perception of safety, because they didn't have any measure as altruism as such. Our results contradict those studies, but are consistent with the findings of the literature that have used recognition of neighbors as a measure of social integration. Note that the recognition of neighbors also gets captured by the way we have constructed the instruments for a collective. And this also clearly validates the finding of a theory model that established a negative relationship between altruism and crime, of course, in a region with low crime expenditure that is taken care of primarily in the subsampling section. So what we do for the subsample, we take the expenditure in police and prison from the NCRP and segregate the states. We take a median value and segregate the states with high and low expenditure respectively. And then we run two separate regressions and try to compare and contrast the results. So these are the results of the subsamples. So what we see is, if you see the expenditure, the areas or the states with low expenditure of prison are having a negative relationship, which is consistent with the results of a theory model. And the areas with high expenditure, if you see, are having no input, so insignificant. So that means we hypothesize that these states are hovering around the maximum value of IA, where of course the del I by del A star is basically zero, so the slope is zero. So that's a maximum point of IA curve beyond which the relationship would change. So we believe that these states are hovering around that maximum point, and that's why the relationship came to be insignificant. And of course, these states with high prison expenditure, we say that the expenditure, even though it's saying that high prison expenditure, but the expenditure in this particular is not as high as it should be for the to alter the relationship between collective action, which is altruistic parameter, and crime perception. So to conclude, what are the contributions of this particular paper? Firstly, our study highlights how the existence of social capital in this particular context, of course, the altruistic parameter or altruism, not only fosters cooperative behavior in society, but also influences crime perception of the people to a great extent. And secondly, and most importantly, our study has acknowledged that there are certain socio-demographic factors that act as a mediator, and such factors should be taken into consideration while dealing with or trying to understand the relationship between any such crime and its correlates and its association with social capital. And if the policymakers do not do that, and they must realize that they treat such mediators independently, then that might do more harm than good. So that was the conclusion. And the limitations, of course, it's primarily focused on the rural agrarian society, so we cannot generalize it for the urban crimes. And we believe that given the nature of the questions asked in the ISDS, we cannot really tease out the gains to the household in terms of efficiency and the gains from being altruistic. So that's why the proxy to capture altruism, we believe, can be improved upon to a great extent in the consecutive studies. And these are the few references that we have used. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Rounak. Most interesting take on how to think about perceptions of crimes in terms of the people that we have around. I think this would be a great time to have it just thrown open for questions rather than me trying to take more time. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand and I'll call upon you to ask Rounak your question. Sanchayan, yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, Rounak. Thanks. Really exciting paper. One thing I have two questions. The first one is one thing I'm struggling more conceptually, and probably I missed it during the presentation. So you define altruism as cooperative behavior. How do you measure the cooperative behavior in your data set from what you collect? And there are different takes on how sort of people view altruism. I think you've specified a very specific definition of altruism, which is sort of rooted in sociological theory. If we were to sort of change this definition into more sort of economic definition about contribution to a public good scheme or something like that, how would the results change? So that's kind of the first question. The second is more of a suggestion than a question, because you started out by saying that the socioeconomic characteristics are mediators in this relationship. There is a way of checking for mediation which might not involve game theory. It's called mediation analysis. And I think it's quite thoroughly used in the literature. So one suggestion would be, maybe if you're calling it mediator, to check by a mediation analysis, and there can be different kinds of mediation as well, or maybe to not call it a mediator, because I mean, the moment you said mediator at the beginning, this could be my bias, but I thought it would be a mediation analysis, but the way you're testing this is not really mediation analysis. So that's just a point out there, but thank you so much, really exciting.
Thank you, Sanchayan. I really didn't know about this median analysis. I shall look into it and see how we can improve our analysis in a better way. Now, to answer the first part of your first question, so there's a question in the IHTS survey which says that, which specifically asks a particular household if that particular household involves in the collective activity. So if there is a problem which can be solved collectively in a house, in a particular village, whether that particular household is interested in solving that activity together with all other households to address a particular issue, or they want to solve it individually at their own houses. So basically they can do it in both ways. So if that same problem can be solved collectively, let's say water management problem in the society, that can be solved individually and also collectively. So if you go to the collective, then that might help those who are in need or those who may not be able to solve it individually. So whether are you willing to go and get involved in that, or you want to solve it individually and concerned about the efficiency gains out of it. So that is this thing. And second part is, yes, I understand the way you are talking about the contribution to public good, or let's say the famous paper by Anne Jenny, warm glow effect, and that literature, right? So what basically the way we wanted to motivate our paper is, of course, through collective action, the channels of that. And if you see the structurally, this paper, the construction of the objective function is similar to the paper by Bester and Guth on evolutionary altruism. Okay, so that's structure that we try to follow. That's how we need to motivate the structure that we do. But yes, by definition, we wanted to go by the sociological definition, because we wanted to say that there are some socio-demographic mediators that are necessary, need to be taken into consideration while viewing any such relationship. And that's why we resorted to this kind of definition. And I don't know if I go into the public good type of definition, introduce that in the paper, how will it change? I don't know, but I'll surely look into it. Thank you for raising that point. Thank you, Shreya.
Great. Any other questions coming in? If not, I'll quickly take the last couple of minutes that we have to ask you a couple of questions, also get some clarification on certain things. So please correct me if I'm wrong. So the crime one variable, which is one of the measures of crime perception and the one against which you get the strongest result, if I'm not wrong. There, the idea was that this is a binary variable that takes on the value 1 if there has been an actual crime committed in the last 12 months against that household.
So Yes, so you asked the household if there was anyone who tried to threat you or who tried to forcibly enter your house or who tried to threaten you in any sense. If that happened, if you think that that is somebody has threatened you, or if you consider that to be a definition of threat, then in that particular case you say yes and give a value 1. If not, then we give a value 0. So that to some extent depends upon how you're defining threat also. Yes.
Sure. So my only trouble with that will be that there is a very fine line between an actual crime and the perception of crime. It's not clear to me at this stage as to what exactly is being measured by this variable, because it's quite possible that the reporting will be based on actual events that would be thought of as crimes, as opposed to my general perception, which to a layman would be what would be the expected number of crimes in the 20-kilometer radius around you, right? So that would be one clarification. And second, very quickly, because I mean, you are using an IV, right? So there has to be a question posed on the strength of the IV itself. So you mentioned that the IV that you're using is that you segregate the altruistic preferences between the idiosyncratic preference of the particular household and the remaining, which essentially comes from society. And the claim is that the remainder that comes from society is exogenous to the idiosyncratic behavior of the household. But in talking about your results, you quite explicitly mentioned that it's quite likely that it is possible that the level of altruism depends on the number of fellow group members, and that group can be defined as per religion or caste in the geographical vicinity of the household, which essentially points to the fact that there is likely to be a high correlation between the idiosyncratic household position and the general level of altruism in, say, the village, the average of the village besides that household. And the moment there is some correlation between the two, the exogeneity assumption falls and the IV doesn't really work. So it would be very nice to see if more effort is put into, say, making that part of it very clear.
Okay, fine. So to answer the first question, first part of your, and thank you for asking the questions and giving the suggestions. Really, the last suggestion is really very important. Okay, so to answer the first question, given the nature of the questions available in IHTs, so basically there are 4 such questions. The last one, which we did not take into consideration, which basically talks about harassment in the area that you are living in, that was more to do with the perception, but we could not take that into consideration because that will bring in the gender bias or the gender aspects, and gender aspect, the harassment itself might call for a different kind of a treatment. So we had to focus on the first 3 questions essentially. So if you see the first 3 questions cannot also really be considered as the total number of crimes that happened. So basically they're asking if you think that somebody in your house entered forcibly, or if you think that there was a theft committed, then you say yes or no. So I do understand your point when you say that, you know, it would be there's a high possibility that it will be related to the total number of crimes happening in the society. We do agree with that, but we also believe that if a particular crime theft or threat happens in a particular society, that will influence the perception of that particular household to a great extent, because in that particular case, that household might be influenced to such an extent that even if the total number of crimes happening in the society is low, because that particular household faced a small theft and threat in that particular area, that might induce or that might influence the particular person to say yes or no to a great extent. So that was our idea in initial stage, given the nature of the question, which has its own limitation. I understand and agree to that. And secondly, there is another stream of literature that talks about perceived risk of getting victimized. So they say that if somebody has already been victimized, there's a high possibility that the perception of that particular household will always be higher. So that also we have taken into consideration, because if a particular household is getting victimized, that means if it has been threatened or somebody has stepped into the house of the particular household, we believe that would invariably contribute to the perception of the household to a great extent. So indirectly, that's how we are trying to capture the perception given the nature of the question or the positive data. And the second one is, that's an interesting aspect that you mentioned. I didn't really think of it. Even though the first instrument seems right, but the second one as you said, there might be high correlation between them. So I would look into it surely and see if we can improve upon it. Thank you for that.
Great, thanks a lot. So we'll quickly move on to our second paper today. This will be by Sanchayan Banerjee. I request you to take, can you share your screen? Yeah, working. Excellent. Please go ahead, Sanchayan. We can't really hear you. Maybe you're muted. Can't be certain.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, works now.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation, Rounak, and thank you all for being here. What I will be presenting today is the idea of how we can build in reflection in behavioral climate policies. And the microeconomics of this essentially goes to the literature on nudging. And essentially what I'm proposing is a new form of nudging, which is called Nudge Plus, that embeds transparency and reflection into the nudging literature. I'll keep out a lot of math. So my presentation is going to look really different from Rounak, but I can assure you there is math going on at the background. I'm very happy to speak to anyone later. Now, just to give you a broad idea of why this is important, people have been interested in behavioral insights for the last 10 or 15 years. And essentially what these behavioral insights mean is it's an evidence-based inductive approach where we let the data speak really to inform how we make policies around human decision-making and behaviors. And as you can tell, this is quite an interdisciplinary field coming from economics, psychology, neuroscience, and sociology, amongst others. And essentially, I would be bringing in the economics in here today. And from the right, what you can see is a graph from the OECD recently that shows more than 200 institutions currently are using these behavioral insights and making public policies. So it's really important how we think about this field. And for a long time, the use of these behavioral insights have been synonymous to the application of nudges. What you can see on my screen are the covers of 4 different editions out of 9 of Richard Thaler's work on nudges. And by definition, let me put it out there first, is a nudge is just any aspect of the choice architecture. This is literally the design of the environment in which we make decisions, which affect our behavior. And they do not forbid any options. So they're not bans, they're not taxes, they do not change any incentives. It's just the way things are presented to us. So you can think about this as an information signal, really. Different nudges have been used in the literature. And here I'm going to show you one example, which is a recent meta-analysis by Kadario and Chandan. And essentially they show that different kinds of nudges have been used to change food habits. And these can include labeling. So for instance, people label food as green, amber, or red to indicate that something is like a traffic light, where green means this is the best and red means you shouldn't be consuming it. There are size enhancements, which essentially change the portion size. There can be defaults where you sort of defaulted into a set menu. You can think of this as going into Chinatown and being handed out a set menu for a Christmas period or a festive period or something of that sort. So the applications are quite massive and they have been used in different sectors. Now, why should we care about food? And most of the applications of nudges around food have been concerned around personal reasons of obesity, and you should be consuming something for health reasons, but there is also a pertinent environmental reason that can shown to you by the graph. And essentially, these food items are really carbon intensive. Now, many of us do not know, but unconsciously, the food that we eat contributes to about 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions globally in a year. And to put it in context, this is equivalent to the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that is generated by the transport sector globally. So think of all of us, 7 billion people or however many we are, riding all the buses, cars, flights, everything that we use as a mode of transport. the emissions that it generates, we generate equivalent amount of emissions just from eating the food that we eat. And these are life cycle emissions, essentially. So it considers emissions from consumption until production. And the carbon intensiveness of these items vary. So you can see items like beef and lamb and all the ruminant meat, including dairy products, are almost 4 times as high as something like white meat or white fish like chicken or salmon or cod fish, anything. So it's really important that we start thinking about the diets that we eat. And a lot of applications of these nudges for dietary reasons for the environment have been occurring in the last few sort of years. And this is a tweet from COP26, which happened this year in Scotland. And essentially, they tried to label the food items, and it took Twitter by storm because people started claiming that all the items on the menu were almost 7 times as intensive than the Paris Agreement would need us to be. So it's really hard, and nudges might not be effective for something like addressing climate change. And this is just for an idea that there are other sorts of economic tools that we can use. And some of these tools can involve things like carbon taxes, and people might not like carbon taxes. So nudges do give us a way out because people like these libertarian tools in taking us to where we want to be. But there's several reasons of why this nudge is not enough. And there's work in the literature. So Cass has worked a lot on showing that people have core habits and strong preferences. So if we simply change the environment, it might be unethical and also might not end up changing the habits because we are unaware of the change. And there have been criticisms that they are dark, they operate sort of compromising agency, and so on and so forth. So my contribution in this space, and this is what I've been working for the last 5 years in my PhD at LSE, is to come up with this new toolkit, which is called Nudge Plus. And essentially what Nudge Plus does, I'm going to show you how the microeconomics of it works, is it brings together the fast and the slow brain, which is essentially Kahneman's work in psychology. And it says that you can make people respond slowly to a nudge. And the way we do that economically is essentially make them reflect about their own preferences. So essentially, some of these preferences, as Rounak was saying as well, altruism would be a part of it. You can make people think deeply about what they want to do before presenting them with a nudge that wants to take them there. So what I do in this paper is essentially I try to test these nudge and nudge pluses in trying to reduce carbon-friendly or increase carbon-friendly diets, reduce carbon intensiveness in the diets. And the way I do it is using an online RCT, using about 3,000 people in the UK. It's a representative sample. And what I show is that embedding reflection about your own preferences along with the nudges increases the effectiveness of the nudges. They are almost about 14 percentage points more effective than simple standalone nudges. So simply heuristically trying to change people's behavior might not give us as much results as we might get by making people think about why that is important and then helping them through with the nudge. And towards the end, I'll talk about a few challenges. Now, let me quickly take you through some of the visual representation of the math of my model, and essentially consider, this is based on Herbert Simon and his paper on 1955-58 on bounded rationality. Think of this square as a set of alternatives. This is a consumption space. You can think about all the consumption bundles in the space that you can choose from. A naught in this is a smaller subset, which is a set of affordable alternatives. So essentially what I do in moving from A to A naught is say there's a budget constraint, guys. Look, you can't be consuming everything. There's a smaller space that you can be consuming. And essentially what Herbert Simon, and so far all the neoclassical economics we've been following, is this idea of bounded rationality, that even though everything is affordable in this set of A naught, our attention might be very limited to a smaller subset of perceived alternatives, which here is being represented by A hat. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some decisions in life where we try to evaluate all the choices that are available to us. So A hat can be equivalent to A naught. But in most scenarios, it is highly probable that this will be a subset of this theory. Now, essentially, the way this decision-making theory works is we have an information signal which links every sort of alternative in this A hat set to a set of outcomes, which, given our axiomatic preferences on utility functions, are mapped onto some payoffs. And depending on the ranking of this payoffs, we choose something from A hat. Now, what I do is I'm going to show you here how a traditional tool like a price or a quantity intervention might work. Essentially, what a tax or what a ban does is it shrinks the size of this alternative set, A naught, which consequently would also shrink the size of A hat. And therefore, everything in the sequence will shrink. And since you have lesser alternatives to choose from, you would maybe choose the kind of alternative that the policymaker tries to get you to. The way a nudge works in this space essentially is by changing the salience of what you consider to be your perceived alternatives. This is why I've been saying that a nudge essentially is like an information signal where it changes the salience or the design without limiting any options. So in a way, if you see, you still have this broader set A naught available to you, but the smaller subset A hat changes because now the policymaker has changed the salience of what is being visible to you. And what I propose with the nudge plus is the two following amendments. So one is this first arrow where we show people and tell them why it is important to change the subset A hat to this new dotted green line. So when a nudge is happening, we tell people what is the reason for the nudge. And two is essentially we make them reflect on the preference axioms, which is shown by this arrow here. And this brings in some idea of reflection into your own preferences. And the way I do it is by using this kind of a setup of an online experiment where essentially people were asked to place a food choice using an online delivery task. And the reason I choose this is essentially this was meant to be a field experiment, which I'm currently running, but because of COVID, things had to change, which was good news for us because the use of these online delivery apps, especially in Western countries like the UK, has increased tremendously in the last sort of 10 years. So this is quite a realistic scenario if we ask people to place an order for an online delivery. So in step one of the experiment, people were informed of the rules. They were presented with a menu, essentially, and this is a real menu from restaurants in the UK. They were asked to select an item from the menu, and this is the control menu here, which consists of 32 items. 16 of them were vegetarian and 16 of them were non-vegetarian. They were then taken to a checkout screen where they were asked to place an order. And finally, in order to measure some sort of behavioral spillovers, we asked them to donate a part of the voucher that they received as part of the task to a charity of their choice. So this is kind of the general setup in which we change step two, which is the kind of menus people were presented with in these following ways. So I tested two different nudges, one of which was the default. Essentially, I told you this is like a set menu. It's a smaller menu, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. And a labeling, which you saw in the COP26, was essentially using different kinds of carbon labels. And along with that, I came up with two kinds of nudge plus transparency, in which essentially people were told, look, this is the default. This is why this default was constructed. Would you like to take it? Same thing happened with the labeling. And then there was a nudge plus reflection when essentially people were asked to think about their own sustainable preferences and whether they want to sort of consume a sustainable diet. We measured their goal orientation before giving them the nudge to take them through. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is an example of the green default. You can see the menu is visibly shorter than the menu that you had seen in the previous case. It is still liberty preserving because the way an opt-out default works is that you're presented with a shorter menu, but you can always opt out from this menu to go to the bigger menu, and still your choice set would be similar. So we're not banning any item, it's just presenting the items and making some items more salient than the other. Now, the nudge plus version of this with transparency was this. You can see the same sort of default appears on the right-hand side of the screen, but preceding that, there was a text which explained why they were being presented with this menu. And also on the menu, if you see the red oval line, that's the additional bit that was also added that said that all items have environmental emissions, and if they don't like, they can opt out of it. This is the other example of reflecting before the default. And essentially now what you see on the left is a pledge where people were informed of what an environmentally sustainable diet is. After being explained, they were said to think about whether they want to consume such a diet. And they had three options. They could either make a pledge, they could be indifferent to it, or they could reject it straight away. Rejection is important. So it's not in the nudge literature, we don't force people to do something. We let people choose what is best for them. And after they went through that, they were then asked to sort of explicitly think about how strongly motivated they were to follow on with these goals. And once people went through this stage, they were then helped with the default nudge to follow on and comply with the nudge. So the idea of the nudge plus is that the heavy lifting initially is done by individuals. And once they come clean with something, then we help them through with the nudge, which brings in this idea of ethicalness and transparency that has been missing with nudges. Just 2 more minutes before I quickly show you the results. So this, what I'm showing you here, is a propensity score matching, just to show you that the randomization worked. This is a propensity score from the demographic characteristics, and essentially all the propensity scores line up to each other. There is no statistical difference, which shows you that the randomization worked clearly. And now in terms of the results, so I'm showing you results from the default nudge and also from the enabling nudge in the same screen. And essentially on the y-axis, you have greenhouse gas emissions from these dietary choices. Less is more, guys, in this case, because lesser emissions means that you're more pro-environmental and you're doing the right thing. And essentially, compared to the control group, you can see that both the nudge and the nudge plus version of the default and the labeling are significantly different, but when you were to compare the nudge with the nudge plus, they're not any better. So just adding transparency in the nudge and telling them how the nudge is constructed is not any good than the nudge. However, things change when you make people reflect. So now I'm in the world of adding a pledge and making people think about their preferences. And now what you see is that all the sort of red, green, and yellow lines are significantly different than the blue, which means the nudges and the nudge pluses are significantly different from the control group. But also the nudge plus, in this case, which is the green one, is significantly better than the nudge in itself. So adding this idea of reflection with the nudge improves the effectiveness of the nudge. And this is almost about another 14% reduction from the nudge in itself. And a lot of people bring in this idea that, oh, wow, if thinking about things will solve the issue, why don't we just make people think about everything? Well, the reason is thinking is burdensome. And what I'm showing you here is a pure thinking task, which I didn't show you how it worked. But essentially, we tried to compare the pure thinking with the nudge and the nudge plus. And in this world as well, the thinking was no better than the nudge. It was only when thinking was added on with the nudge that the effect of the nudge plus turned out to be significantly different from everything else. And there was no negative behavior. So contributions did not decrease in any of these interventions. These are all corrected for multiple hypothesis comparisons. And this leads to a good story because involving in one good action does not spill over to other bad actions, which is quite an issue in the literature with the idea of moral warm glow, where if you do something good, the next decision you make is bad. So in conclusion, we can scale up our behavioral climate policies and general other policies as well by embedding some reflection into nudges. While transparency is good, it's good to be transparent about policies, it does not lead to any better results. It's only when you make people think about what the choices they're going to make, it improves the effectiveness of the nudges. And I do not find any evidence of negative spillovers. So on that note, I'm very happy to take questions now. Thank you so much. You've been a lovely audience.
Great, thank you very much. In terms of questions, do we have anybody who wants to raise their hand and go ahead? Okay, so I'll take the opportunity to ask a few. So as you did mention that there is, of course, the possibility of people self-selecting out, and that's not an immaterial part of the experiment. Is it possible to get a sense of how many people selected out of either the default or the pledge? Or both?
Yeah, so about 10% of the people, when they were given with the pledge, opted out of the pledge. And of the 90% of the people, about 5% who took the pledge, when they were shown the default menu, they opted out of the default later on. So about 15% of the sample selected themselves out of the green default.
So essentially, the best way to think of these results is people who are interested in being nudged find that the nudges are more effective and they're also reflecting upon their preferences. Is that, would that be the right way to phrase it?
Yes, I think that's a good way to think about it. Also because there's this huge literature that talks about information action gap, or information sort of action behavior gap, where even though we have our motivations in the right place, sometimes we are not able to follow them through. So there's whole literature on Liebson about time preferences and why we can't follow through, being impatient. It's mostly for those kind of people who want to do the right thing, but somehow in the way fail. So nudge pluses are not for everyone, just like nudges are not for everyone, but for the people they target and the people who want them, they can be really effective.
Great. One quick check too. This is more of a clarification. So when I think about the pledge, should I be relating it in my head to like the literature on promises, where essentially you can get a person to be more, let's say, reliable in the choices that they make once there's some hint of a promise, because there's this long social norm of a promise being more valuable than, you know, just stating it. Would that be the best way to think about this? Or
a pledge is the one that I used here is a bit more developed than simple commitment contracts that Taylor and Sunstein have come up as nudges. And the only reason I say that is because in their commitment contracts, essentially, they don't explicitly define a lot of things and don't ask people to think through a lot of things. They just present a contract and say, are you going to sign it or not? So you're in the right direction in terms of thinking it, but a pledge is just more evolved in the steps it follows to sort of take people through the entire commitment process. It's like when you were to sign up for a gym subscription, you can either sign it, which in a nudge world would be the commitment. But then before that, there's a lot of thing where you go to the gym, talk to the instructor, see if the plan is the right thing. All of that combined with the commitment is a pledge.
Sure. So I was thinking more the lines of, and the literature and the prime movers, their name escaped me at the moment, but I remember working on this some while back. So a promise for me would be on the lines of getting people to promise a particular commitment to a voluntary contribution game and see if having made that promise actually influences the actual contribution. And there's some evidence to show that it helps, simply because there is an existing preference for trying to keep to your promise, let's say.
Yes.
On those lines. Okay, one final thing. Also because, I mean, I think everybody has some idea of nudges, but until you actually engage with the literature, you only have a very superficial idea. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around some of the issues that you raised. So essentially, at least in this structure, the way you portrayed it. So I'm a standard microeconomic theorist, right? So I look at bounded rationality. I understand the first part of what you said. And to some extent, essentially, the nudge is one, getting you out of your bounds. So in the sense, having your preferences more defined over options over which they might not have been defined earlier, and then giving you a reason why they should be defined in a certain way.
That's a nudge plus, yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think there is a lot of there's a lot of criticism and also ambiguity about the definition of nudges. But if you were to stick with mine, you're right that what a nudge does is shifts this bound from one part of this choice set to another part of the choice set. And what the nudge plus does is then explains why this bound has been shifted, or makes you think more about your preferences while shifting the bounds.
Great. So, and I'll quickly check again if anybody else has any questions, because I don't want to hog all of your time, even though I do want to talk about this a little bit more. So if anybody else has questions, please raise your hand, and I'm sure Sanchayan will be happy to take them. And if they're not forthcoming, then I'll go ahead with mine. Okay. So here's my question to you. So as somebody who's working with nudges, of course, nudges are more difficult when preferences are better defined. So if I am a person, say I've been around the world, I've eaten all the food that I could eat, and have a very strong sense of what I like and what I dislike, you would expect that nudges are likely to be less effective in that particular scenario. Now, given that is the case, so here's an idea that I want to float by you. So this is not in direct reference, but this could be, I don't know, nudge plus plus, I guess. So the idea is reformulating the context within which you create your preference, or your preference ordering is defined. And here I have a quick example that, I mean, I'm guessing many of, I mean, particularly you who works in this area might have come across this. So there's this story where there was a huge problem of killing of whale sharks off the coast of Gujarat, to the extent that they had almost been hunted to extinction. The trouble was that the fisherman community over there was rather not very well to do. So it was very difficult for anyone to convince them not to kill a whale shark, because one whale shark kill means essentially that your family is well fed for the next 6 months. So they sat on it and thought about it, and eventually came up with this idea, which was driven by a young biologist, also a conservationist who had gone there. And in conversation with the local priest, where the biologist informed the priest that these whale sharks come over here to lay their young. So essentially their migration pattern is that they spend half the year in Australia, and once it's time for them to lay their young children, they come all the way to the coast of Gujarat. And the priest formulated the idea that these are daughters of the village who are coming back at the time of maternity, essentially looking for parental care. And changing the context within which the preferences were formed led to a drastic decrease in the number of whale shark kills, to the extent that it's been almost eliminated in the last 3 or 4 years. I'm not sure what the pandemic has done. I mean, economic destitution can force you into all sorts of actions. But I'm wondering if this is something that you've thought of or would think might be useful, particularly in cases where preferences are very well defined.
No, this is a great idea. Actually, I am working on a paper which kind of talks about this. We call it the social brain. And essentially what we say is that think of all kinds of individuals like the brain. So individual become nodes on the brain, and then you're lying on a fabric, which is kind of the neural network, which then relates the sort of the environment in which we are. And then there are some sort of neural linkages between the different nodes, which emphasizes sort of these interpersonal linkages, which can be defined by the society and lot. And I think you're absolutely right, because a lot of this actually depends on the fabric and the relationships you have with people. So most of the nudges and nudge pluses, in defining them, the very individualistic changes, they target just the individual, but there's so much happening around you that if you actually start institutionalizing these changes by bringing into account the environment, a lot of that might change, because this is very context specific. So I would actually write back to you. I think the story is very good for that paper.
Excellent, sure. That would be wonderful. Great. Other questions coming in from anyone else? If we haven't got any, I think we can move forward to the next presenter. Thank you very much, Sanchayan. It was wonderful. So yeah, great. Next up, we have Shreya Malhotra, who will be presenting on prenuptial agreements and domestic violence. So Shreya, if you could share your slides, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So today I'll be presenting my paper on prenuptial agreements and how does it affect domestic violence particularly. So what I basically want to say it over here or target here is that if we have prenuptial agreements, which are generally not very much enforceable around the world, then would it affect domestic abuse within marriage? Would it affect domestic violence within marriage? This is how the entire presentation today is structured. I'll be talking about some background study, the literature review, what motivated me. So my research question, I'll take you through the framework, the results, and the policy implications that I draw out of it. So what exactly a prenup is? A prenup is basically a written agreement between two individuals who plan to marry in future. And it basically includes clauses on how individuals should behave during marriage, as well as how your assets would be divided in case you feel that you need a divorce. It is generally seen as a tool to prevent or to protect your assets. During the period of marriage, partners also make relationship-specific investments which require time, money, financial resources, and effort. So there are two kinds of assets which I feel there are. So one is your acquired asset, and then one is the inherited asset. When anybody wants to marry or plans to marry in future, so he has his inherited assets, the assets which he brings into the marriage, and then there are also acquired assets or the assets which you accumulate within marriage. So then how much investment you do into the marriage would also lead to accumulation of your assets. So a prenup basically would be a written agreement which will decide as to how, if at all you plan to take a divorce later on, then how would these assets be divided in future. There are, of course, some positive sides and negative sides to it. So the negative side to is that, see, the bargaining power of individuals are not same, and therefore prenup might just end up causing pain to the party with weak bargaining power, and therefore that the one who has the weak bargaining power might not be able to have their say on various clauses at the time of contract bargaining. So contract bargaining usually takes place before marriage. And of course, there are positives to it. So the pros are that it saves partners seeking divorce from the mental torture at the time of divorce. So we need to see as to what are the cons and what are the pros, and then we can, anybody who wants to take up prenup later on can decide as to what he or she wants to do. The literature is there, although scanty, but yes, there are few papers which talks about why there is dearth of prenuptial agreements. So Maher in 2003 has identified two reasons as to why there are not many prenuptial agreements being signed. One is that partners basically undervalue the potential benefits of prenuptial agreement, because couples are usually very overly optimistic about the kind of marriage they are getting into. So they also feel that the probability of failure of their marriage is low, and therefore they're not really interested in signing a prenup. Also, if you ask for signing a prenup before marriage, it gives negative signals to the other party that, okay, this is what the kind of marriage he or she is expecting to get into, and he might just want to take up divorce later on. So, okay, fine, is this the reason why you're taking a prenup? So it is going to send negative signals as well. There's another paper by Ritika and Chatterjee in 2004 who theoretically saw that, okay, yeah, there are economic reasons as to why rational agents might not feel like signing prenuptial agreements. So he lays stress on the absence of prenups as a signaling device for couples. So as Maher in 2003 identified that it might just send negative signals. So what I feel is that it is just an extension where he divides the individuals into two types, high productivity and low productivity. And then high productivity agents are more willing to spend effort to the benefit of a partnership. So when you are into the marriage, you are more willing to spend the effort, you are more willing to give your time to the benefit of the partnership than the low productivity ones. So what they get is a separating equilibrium where the high type would not want to sign a prenuptial agreement because it enables them to signal their credibility in type. So the literature which I came across gives me an idea that, okay, the prenuptial agreements are not really enforceable. The people even don't even like signing it. And so because there are different reasons to it. This actually led to the research question and motivated me to pursue it further. So I tried to fill the gap in the literature by linking domestic violence with the signing of prenup. So I have a prenup and I know that in marriage there might be some domestic violence. So why not link these two together and see, would signing prenup have an impact on domestic violence or not? The presumption is that if a prenup would include clauses on how partners should behave within marriage, would it help in reducing domestic violence or not? So the idea is that if prenup, let's say, provides for additional compensation from the accused to the victim of domestic violence at the time of divorce, then it might just alter your behavior of the marriage partners. The simple idea is that you make partners bear the cost of violence so that they internalize this new cost while deciding the extent of violence within marriage. So with this context in mind, I construct a three-stage simultaneous move game to evaluate the impact of prenup on domestic abuse. These are the stages. There are two partners, two prospective partners. It's a three-stage game where in stage one, partners who are about to marry, they decide whether should they sign a prenup or not. then so there are two things to it. They are going to marry. It is just that they are deciding whether should I sign the prenup or not. If you don't sign a prenup and if you at all end up divorcing, then at the time of divorce, your assets will be divided according to the state division rule. And if you sign a prenup, then the clauses of prenup that the law and the court and you get to decide, it is based on that as to how your assets will be divided. In stage 2, once you are married, you simultaneously choose your violence level. I assume that violence is assumed to be taken to possible values, VH and VL, where VH is greater than VL. And in stage 3, after observing the violence level of their partner, both decide to file for divorce or not. So there are 3 possibilities that exist. One is that either both file for divorce, exactly one file for divorce, or you have nobody filing for divorce. Because it happens that even if partners get to the extent of domestic violence, we have this mentality that people suffer, but they don't file for divorce. So you can have a possibility where nobody files for divorce, even if you have violence. I'll just quickly run you through the description of the model. I assume that there are 2 types of individuals. One is the high type, and then you have the low type. The assets which I talked earlier also are divided into 2 parts. One is your inherited asset. Inherited assets are those assets which you actually bring into the marriage. And wealthier spouse is supposed to be bringing large amount of assets than relatively poor spouse. Then you have acquired assets which are accumulated in the first period of marriage, and let's say we say that it stays constant till the end of the second stage. So acquired assets could be those assets which you produce with time, or they are purchased in the market. So it could be anything. And acquired assets also is a function of your quality of a partner, which could be decided based on your earning capacity or your bargaining power. So I have the 2 quality types, which is like H and L, and this is the setup. So the acquired assets, if you have low, it would be lesser than if you have HH, or the intermediate acquired assets would be when you have HL combination. The cost of signing prenup is, let's say, 2C, where it is equally shared between the 2 partners. As I explained earlier also, quality of a partner is dependent on his earning capacity, and it is observable at the time of marriage. So this is something which I don't feel is unobservable. You can observe the quality to some extent. High type individuals possess greater earning power and the bargaining power than low type individuals. And then I assume that mutual consent regime is the regime that is prevalent in the society. Now, what is mutual consent regime? Mutual consent regime is that where if you want to avail divorce, the court proceedings and the investigation would start only if both of them agrees to divorce. So see, in the literature or in the US particularly, there has been a shift from mutual consent regime to unilateral divorce regime, where in a unilateral divorce regime, even if one files for divorce, you have the court proceedings which can go on. But in most of the countries, we still have mutual consent regime where the court proceedings where they are not going to start, the investigation is not going to start if both of them are not agreeing to a divorce. So this is the payoff that I assume. Payoff is A plus A is a sum total of acquired plus inherited assets, and then you have the alpha V1, which is your own violence level, minus beta V2, which is your partner's violence level. So the idea is that you get positive utility if you are violent, but at the same time you don't like your partner's violence. So you have his violence being subtracted from the payoff. This is the marriage payoff. Okay, so if let's say partners decide to have a divorce and they end up being divorced, so this is how your assets are going to be divided. If at all you sign up a prenup, you get full value of your respective inherited assets. Share of each partner in acquired assets is agreed on. So let's say the share is gamma 1 or gamma 2, which obviously depends on your bargaining power. And then you have the cost of violence. The violent partner compensates other partner for the violent behavior by lambda times violence. So your divorce payoff would then be your share of your inherited asset, which is A1 and A2 for the two partners, your share of your acquired assets, which is gamma times acquired assets, and then the cost of violence is also there, which is like if you are violent, then you have to pay lambda times V2, but at the same time, it is the net violence which matters in the end. If you have state division rule, then they both get equal share of the total assets and after a formal separation. So you just get half of your asset. There is no violence which is being accumulated into or which is being treated into here if you have a state division rule, because that's what makes it different. The primary reason would be domestic violence. The probability of getting caught would be exogenous to the model, and there is no possibility of informal separation even when both fight for divorce. So as I explained earlier, you either divide your assets through the state division rule, or you divide your assets if at all you sign prenuptial agreement in stage 1 of the game. Of course, it's a 3-stage simultaneous game, so I use backward induction to solve the model. In stage 1, PD star is decided, which is the equilibrium probability of divorce. That would help us in getting to know about the equilibrium violence level in stage 2 of the marriage. And then in stage 1, which is the most important question, which is whether you sign for prenup or not. What are the determinants which would affect your decision to sign a prenup in the marriage? So here I present the normal form game. The normal form game, as you can see, has 2 partners, and there are 2 strategies. Either you file for divorce or you do not file for divorce. If you do not file for divorce, or even if at least one person files and the other person doesn't, then the payoffs are really simple, because then you just get your marriage payoff, and X is the cost of filing for divorce. So if you file, then just your payoff is subtracted by X. But the only important factor over here would be when both file for divorce, because if at all you have mutual consent, then that is what really matters. If you both file for divorce, then your payoffs are really dependent on whether you are caught or whether both of them are caught, and then the whole setup is there. I'll skip the maths portion, but if you want, I can explain it later as to how we get the payoff. So based on the normal form game, we derive the probability of divorce. So here I get a pure strategy where under different cases, so I have 2 cases under different assumptions. We have the type of equilibrium where I get the dominant strategy where both of them are not filing for divorce, and if nobody files for divorce, as you can see, the probability of divorce is 0. Whereas in the second case, we see a pure strategy where both may file for divorce, or so here we have a multiple equilibria where I get a pure strategy where you either both of them file for divorce or nobody files for divorce. Now, what if prenup is signed? Then what is the normal form game? The normal form game would slightly be different from what we had before, because here divorce payoff would change. In the case of state division rule, the divorce payoff was just half of the assets. Here, this is going to have some impact on the violence level also, or the idea is that the cost of violence is being treated here. In the state division rule, there was no violence which was being treated. So here, filing, the payoff changes. Other than that, if you are filing and not filing, since it is a mutual consent regime, the payoff function doesn't really change, but file is what really matters to us. Here also we derive the probability of divorce. So here, under 2 different cases, we get the dominant strategy and multiple equilibria, where I get pure strategy where both file and nobody files. If nobody files, the probability of divorce is 0, whereas if both files, the probability of divorce is subject to whether you are caught. So it really depends on the probability of getting caught, as you can see in the last column. So now I have these propositions before me after solving for the first stage, and then after looking at what really matters, which will impact partners to sign a prenup or not. So the first proposition is that under state division rule, the dominant strategy involves both partners choosing the high violence, which is VH, regardless of whether you file for divorce or you do not file for divorce. So I get a dominant strategy equilibrium where both of them end up choosing VH, irrespective of whether you file or you are not filing for divorce. Then under the second proposition, so now this is something which is really interesting because it says that under few conditions, which is your so what was beta? Beta was majorly the marginal disutility which you get from your partner's violence level. So the marginal disutility, if the marginal disutility is greater than the marginal utility which you get from your own violence level, and then if VH is sufficiently high enough, and also under the condition where you set the cost of prenup, which is greater than this threshold value of lambda star, then there is an equilibrium which exists that both partners end up choosing BL, which is the low violence level. And that is what I think I was interested in because the research question was, is there any case, can we have some cases for which if prenup is signed, would it reduce the domestic violence within marriage or not? So yeah, yes, we get to that point, but under few conditions, then there would be an equilibrium where both of them choosing VL is the one we get, and the probability of divorce in this equilibrium is PD, which of course is PC into 2 minus PC, because the probability of divorce is your investigation going on, and then at least, even if at least one person gets caught, then yeah, you have the probability of divorce, which is PC into 2 minus PC. And I have the last proposition, which is for the stage 1 of the game, which is if both of them chooses or selects VH in equilibrium under the state division rule, and they choose VL in equilibrium under prenup, then prenup would be signed only if the cost of prenup is less than this threshold value C star. So it is a whole term which we can see over here. So the idea is that the cost of prenup also has to be really less in order to induce partners to sign prenup in marriage. So these are the results. Extent of violence selected by partners under the state division rule is high, regardless of whether you file for divorce or not. Prenups do help in reducing violence, but under few conditions. The conditions are the marginal disutility of one's partner's violence level is greater than the utility that you get from your own violence level, which is like your beta has to be greater than alpha. The cost of domestic violence should be set really high. So the lambda should be high enough to induce you to choose low violence level. And the violence level is high enough to ensure that both of them file for divorce in equilibrium in the third stage of the game. There are a few policy implications that I draw out of it. So
you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. These are the policy implications. The cost of prenup should be set really low. The policymakers should provide help in enforcing the terms of prenup, because see, even if prenups are signed and later on, if they're not enforced, then there's no use of a prenup. So policymakers must provide help in enforcing the terms of prenup in quotes. And then it's not just about signing prenup, it has a whole lot of social stigma attached to it. So the idea is that if we could have more social acceptability, or if we can reduce the effective cost, then maybe we can have prenup, and then it is there, people are signing it, and then if they are enforced, then it might just help us in reducing domestic violence, and which can of course come up through use of media, is what I believe. So that's all. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to address the questions now.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the wonderful presentation. Questions coming in from the people we have in the session. Yeah, Sanchayan, go ahead.
Sorry, this is just too fascinating for me. When you put the quality by earning, I went into Indian matchmakers and my parents thinking about when to get me married. Anyway, really fascinating presentation. What I was thinking, so I have two questions. One is, there is a literature out there which kind of looks into the relationship of income or socioeconomic factors with domestic violence in India. I think there was a recent study that kind of showed that rising income decreases it. Of course, it's not causal, but I'm thinking, is there some sort of implicit endogeneity that might come in your model? Especially, I'm thinking of not as a one-shot interaction, but let's say this is repeated interaction game, where if you come from a family which had a good socioeconomic background, does that then somehow feed or pre-levels of domestic violence feed into signing the prenup, which then goes into sort of affecting the domestic violence? I'm not sure if I'm being totally clear here with my train of thought, but yeah, is there some sort of endogeneity there? And the second question is actually, let me clarify first. So in both the state division and your prenup, you said that not signing or not filing for divorce was one of was it the dominant strategy that came up, and then you had multiple equilibria where you had pure strategies? Is that,
Yeah.
was that right? Yeah. So I'm wondering again, isn't this like a prisoner's dilemma framework? And if you can sort of bring in some sort of tit for tat, which again goes into some sort of sequential mechanism of this, rather than a one shot where I don't know if it's constantly revised, this prenup, or something where it's not just a one-off, but you can revisit this over a period of time, or yeah, something on those lines. Yeah, that's it. I'm not sure if I was totally clear, but your thoughts are really appreciated.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions and your suggestions. I think the first question was related to the relationship between how your income would affect your domestic violence. Is that so? Yeah, so that is there. Yeah, of course, if I think it can be modeled, but I cannot be sure of the fact that yes, whether your income is going to affect your domestic, the range of violence which you may or might not have. Because of course, education could also be one of the factor which would affect your domestic violence, your mentality, or what you call it.
Yeah, I think you're in there. I think what I'm trying to suggest is that these things are highly correlated with one another. So all these kind of socioeconomic attributes, income, education, and stuff. So I'm wondering if there's a way to bring in some factor that captures your socioeconomic status, which then is a predictor of domestic violence. And I'm wondering if that might change your results.
Yeah, I think it is a good suggestion. I would definitely do that. Yes, because of course you're right in this sense. It could be one of the extensions where your indicators could have an impact on domestic violence. And what was the second thing?
No, the second question was mostly around these multiple equilibria and sort of coming to the point that not filing for divorce is a dominant strategy. So I was wondering if some sort of tit for tat in this one-shot interaction, or some sort of updating the prenup in a longer version of this game as you go along might change that and push you from the dominant strategy to sort of the other equilibria, which is filing for the divorce.
Okay, so have a setup where, let's say I have a repeated game and things change over time, and then what is the result? Okay.
Yeah, or there is some sort of cost. I need to think a bit more about it, but yeah, imposing some sort of bounds in there so that it may be thinking about the policy implication of this is how can we move from the dominant strategy, which is not filing for divorce, to the other equilibria, which is filing for divorce. And that's where maybe you can, with your policy suggestion at the end, maybe that's something which you can think about being implementable in Indian context, that what is that thing which will move you from this strategy to the other strategy. I think that is really important. Also, just to...
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Go on, sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think one question I had is, what is the uptake of prenups in India? I have no clue, but I know that this is not quite socially acceptable.
They're not enforceable, and they're not there. In US, you have it to some extent, and in Europe also you have it, but in India, no.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I have making.
Great. So a couple of quick suggestions based on what Sanchayan has said. So in terms of socioeconomic indicators, essentially your alpha and betas are the model parameters that capture that, right? So that's the extent to which I benefit from violence and the extent to which other person suffers from the violence that I've created. So my suggestion would be that if you're looking at incorporating potential socioeconomic indicators, even if not empirically, at least providing some theoretical basis for it, essentially then alpha and beta become functions of your socioeconomic attributes. So for instance, if you come from a household where you have seen a lot of domestic violence, you are, I mean, I'm not sure what the psychological literature says, but if it says that then you enjoy, say, violence more, then your alpha goes up, let's say. So that would be a quick way to get around that. In terms of dominant strategies, I mean, the thing is that your equilibria is very, very sensitive to how payoffs are framed. So for instance, a non-mutual divorce filing is a dominated strategy no matter what, under both the setups. And that's predominantly driven by the fact that you say that anything only happens if both parties file together. Now, I understand that say in a setting like India, the finalization of divorce proceedings is much quicker if it's a mutual divorce. If it's a contested divorce, it of course becomes very complicated. But the reason why you're getting, let's say, pure strategy, dominant strategy equilibria of people not filing for divorce is because of that assumption. So as, let's say, resilience check, you might want to relax that assumption and see what kind of results you get and in terms of what parameter configurations. So with those suggestions, I have a quick question and then a few more suggestions about the policy, this thing. So in terms of the question, could you quickly go to proposition 1? Right. So this for me is the key result, right? So essentially what you're saying that under rules as they exist today, let's say whatever the state division is, I mean, you have assumed it to be 50-50, it may not always be, but let's take that to be the case. People who don't get in prenups are very violent in their marriages. Now that is a very strong claim. And it would be interesting to trace what is the point or what is the specific assumption about the model payoffs or specific assumptions about the payoffs in the model that leads to this result. Because my suspicion is you will get very strong pushback on this because the result, I mean, I know why we are getting this, but it would be very useful if you emphasize on the intuition from where this is coming. And if this is a result that's very susceptible to a particular model assumption, it's not the worst idea to have a separate section where you relax it and show that, then this changes outcomes. So in fact, rather than asking it as a question, I've just phrased it as a suggestion. So, but I'll just take a few more minutes and go through with this. So one of the limitations in the way that you have defined prenups is that you have assumed it to be a complete contract.
I've assumed it to be?
To be a complete contract, that essentially you can contract every possible level of violence that has been committed.
Okay.
And that, of course, makes it artificially stronger than what it actually is likely to be. Because, I mean, by now we have this entire huge, enormous, long literature on incomplete contracts, where essentially the idea is that contracts cannot be complete. And because they're not complete, you get into all sorts of measurement problems. And then you get into the mechanics of having potentially setting up, say, another paper that you might want to write about how the lack of measurement or the difficulties in actually measuring violence and therefore contracting it creates all sorts of dynamics in the litigation process. That's where the entire family law lawyer group make their money from. So that'll be an interesting thing to see. One quick suggestion to end up with what is turning out to be a rather lengthy time-taking thing. So here's just a general thing that comes from the behavioral literature. Official contracts or incentive mechanisms that are imposed upon norms that have existed on for a long time sometimes leads to outcomes that are unpredictable. So I'll give you a very quick example. This is from Dan Ariely's book. It's a wonderful book. Everybody should take some time to read it. And he talks about a childcare center in Israel who are having problems with parents turning up late to pick up their kids. And of course, this was a problem for the childcare center. So they started fining parents. And the idea was that if you find parents, that reduces the incentive for them, for instance, in your model, because you have to pay for the violence you are engaging in under a prenup, you will engage in less violence. There, the idea was that because people have to pay fines for turning up, they're likely to turn up earlier, or not be as late. What they found is that parents turned up even later than what they used to. And when they asked them, why is it that this odd thing is happening when we have clearly disincentivized you, the parents' response was, earlier when we would turn up, we would feel embarrassed and ashamed because I have to pick up my child from a person that I have to meet personally, look them in the eye. Now I know that I'm paying for it. So I'm paying to be late. And if I have sufficient money, how does it matter? And that is where sometimes policy suggestions around things like prenups can be tricky. So my suggestion would be that it has to be threshed out a lot more before we come up with policy suggestions, because even in markets that they have been around for a while, like the US, it's not really been, I mean, empirically, it's not had a big impact in terms of the outcomes. The only potential correlation that at least I am aware of in the literature is that the divorce rate tends to be very high when you have a prenup, which is the Marr argument, as you pointed out right at the beginning of the presentation, that this is a bad signal in general. But yeah, thank you very much. If anybody else has any questions, we can quickly take them up. If not, then we can bring this session to a close.
I have a doubt. So you have just pointed out 3 suggestions. One was that I have assumed that it's a complete prenup. And what was the second one that you were trying to focus on? The third one was from incentive mechanism. What was?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the second one is I think the idea of being able to measure violence. I think the idea of the first one was to have a very strong intuition for the very first proposition that you have. Yeah, and the second one was around the ideas of measuring violence, that of course feeds into the idea of complete contracts, that you can only have a complete prenup if you can really contract out every level, every possible level. And there you get into all sorts of measurement problems, right? So say a slap from one partner is not equal to a slap from the other partner because the impact of the slap depends on the muscle, whatever, of the person slapping. So I mean that would be the way to think through this. But yeah, Sanchayan, you have a question. Go ahead.
Not a question, just thinking about this idea of complete and incomplete contracts. I think one thing which another way to formalize this could be also about the idea of post-nups. I don't know if you've heard about post-nups. These are when people are in marriage, it helps them to constantly update the prenup and also sign something for the future, sort of looking like a futuristic vision. So this idea of constantly updating and also sort of a complete incomplete contract, you could look into multiple contracts being in place and how that might change. But I do agree with Vatsalya that there are very nuanced difficulties in this. So I really like the idea though.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes, same here. And I would highly recommend getting a lawyer on board. There's a lot of value that a lawyer can add to this. If nothing else, because the state division rule, I mean, it serves as a useful benchmark, but we know now that family law, particularly in common law jurisdictions, has evolved to an extent where the separation rules are incredibly sophisticated, and they take into account a lot of factors, which me being a non-lawyer, I mean, I don't pretend to know too much about this, but I mean, I would think that you would gain significantly, and so would the paper, by sitting together with a family lawyer or a civil lawyer and sorting out the nuances of the law. But thank you very much to all 3 of our speakers, Rounak, Sanchayan, and Shreya. I hope this was good fun and that the feedback would turn out to be useful. It was great having you here. I had a lot of fun. And take care. And it would be great, I mean, if you can stay in touch, maybe some of these suggestions would actually end up in paper form, and I would love to read all of them.
Yeah, I think I got some useful suggestions. Thank you so much.
Great. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much.